Hello. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for the ongoing Carleton University Disability Research Group seminar series, Accessibility, Inclusion, and Disability, Connecting Scholars and Practitioners. I'm Ryan Patterson with the CUDRG and the Carleton Accessibility Institute. I'm a white man, glasses, brown parted hair, short brown beard, no mustache, collared shirt, jacket. And we are also joined by the series co-organizers, Professor Dominique Marshall and Natalie Amato, and a wonderful international audience. While the seminar is virtual, we acknowledge that Carleton University campus is located on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. And we are very fortunate today to have two stellar scholar practitioners with us to explore the history and present of institutionalization of people with disabilities and alternatives to it, both now and hopefully better and better ones into the future. Megan Linton, PhD candidate in sociology and political economy at Carleton University, and writer and host of the Invisible Institutions podcast. And Keenan Wellar, longtime co-leader and director of communications of the Ottawa-based nonprofit organization LiveWorkPlay. Please note, everyone, that we have muted all of you, the attendees, until the discussion portion of the seminar, and that this event is being recorded for an online exhibit featuring this and all of the seminars at the end of the series. So, being muted, as I pass to Megan, please join me visually through either apps or just clapping your hands up in the air, welcoming both of our speakers.
Okay. Thank you all so much for being here today. And if there's any challenges with being able to see my presentation, just slide into the chat and I will get to you and hopefully fix the whatever error I may encounter. My name is Megan, and I'm going to be talking today and bringing you inside the invisible institution industry. I want to begin the presentation recognizing that I am currently on unceded Algonquin territory and that right now there is an ongoing negotiation for land claims, and that the Rideau Regional Center, which is the largest institution for people labeled with intellectual and developmental disabilities that closed in 2009, is currently up for sale. It is a massive piece of stolen property, and recognizing that this is part of the institution industry in the province, and that our role as settlers is to go about making sure that we are good citizens on the land and getting the land back as we can. So today I am going to go through some new research that is talking about the industrialization, the profitization of disability institutions. And so I'm going to walk you through the framework I go through and then bring you into the institution, its mythologies, and then go through the systems of financialization and institutionalization. And within those systems, the various industries and profiteers that benefit from the ongoing incarceration of disability institutions in Canada. A note that I'm going to go back and forth using person-first language, specifically when talking about people labeled with intellectual and developmental disabilities, because of the preference and the history within the disability community. When I talk about broader disability, I tend to use disability first language, recognizing that that's my preference as a disabled person. And I will note that this presentation will include discussions specifically of institutionalization, forced medication, and the use of restraints. The framework for understanding institutions as an industry comes from a long line of disability research, which understands disability and the institutionalization of disability through what they call the money model, which sees that disabled body minds are worth more to the GDP in an institutional bed than in their own bed. And so we can understand this then that people with disabilities are used to create a profit for the state. So 50 years ago, the government of Ontario first released its report demanding an end to the institutionalization of labeled people. Today, we know that institutionalization continues to be the dominant response to the housing and support needs of the population. And this reliance on institutional settings, despite the decades of evidence demonstrating worse outcomes, is a bit curious. These worse outcomes include higher than average death rates, high rates of chemical and physical restraint, social isolation, and labor market exclusion. The reliance on these settings, despite their pervasive and violent harms, is a result of the commodification of disabled body minds that has happened through post-industrial capitalism. This is what some disability political economists refer to as the money model, and it's how we're going to understand institutions through this presentation. The money model, also called DIS-INC, recognizes the intersection of disability incarceration and disability incorporation. So the inclusion of some disabled people through capitalism, and then the incarceration of those deemed not profitable into sites of institutionalization. We know that institutionalization itself is a commodified intervention to disability, which relies upon other commodified interventions like chemical and physical restraints and therapeutic intervention techniques. Each of these techniques are interwoven with private and public interests, and it's a complicated whirlwind of systems, actors, institutions, and profit models. Okay, so before we dive into the institution, I should probably let you know what an institution is. So, disability institutions have a flexible and curious name. Institution is quite broad, but we can recognize it together as places that jointly administer care and loathing. So, at once, they are supposed to provide medical supports while also administering punishment, penalization, medicalization, and restraint. The Joint Task Force on Deinstitutionalization uses the definition of institution of any place in which people with disabilities are not free to be. And so those definitions together help us understand a large variety of sites of institutionalization. This includes places like long-term care homes, group homes, unregulated disability institutions, residential care facilities, supported independent living facilities, and psychiatric institutions. That's a short list. We'll get into the long list in a little bit. So on the screen, you see a purple person wearing a yellow shirt with forearm crutches. I use very similar ones. And on the screen, it reads the myth. Some of mankind's most terrible misdeeds have been committed under the spell of certain magic words or phrases. This quote comes from James Bryant Cohen, and it appeared alongside an image of solitary confinement in Burton Blatt's 1966 book, Christmas in Purgatory. The image is quite different from the cartoon purple person that appears on the screen right now. The purple person on the screen comes from a Developmental Services Ontario video that talks about person-directed group home services. Now, magic phrases like supported independent living, community group homes, least restraint possible, and person-directed phrases help us feel better about contemporary forms of institutionalization. And Burton Blatt, in his book, really prophetized that group homes and community group living would be much better. But as DSO and Blatt realized quite later, um, the advocacy for group homes and the support for advocacy that resulted in group homes really just was window dressing for institutionalization, a layer of paint on the psychiatric institution floor. And so we know that institutions are not person directed. They do not employ the least restraint possible, and independence is a pretty faulty term in these places. As Liat Ben Moshe demonstrates with an American lens, federal funding flows through advocacy organizations, organizations that use words like person directed and support and inclusion and incorporation. But what actually happened through deinstitutionalization was that these advocacy organizations transformed into service provider agencies, increasing their dependence on the state and institutionalization itself. So, under this model, the nonprofit system relies on and accepts social death of disabled people because radical politics have been transformed into liberal goals of inclusion and incorporation. But this is a myth, and we know this. We know this because of the broad systems of institutionalization. So on the screen, you see a small, very large, and expansive map. You don't need to see necessarily what's inside, but rather this slide demonstrates how expansive this system of institutionalization is. Over the last 50 years, the privatization of the public sector through various regimes of neoliberal governments have transformed institutionalization from one large institution into a proliferation of privately operated institutions such as group homes, domiciliary hostels, residential care facilities, long-term care institutions, and how these various different discrete systems work is that there's significant shortages in both our housing systems and our nonprofit institutions. There's about 17,000 people in institutions and 15,000 people waiting for institutions. What this does is it shifts those people waiting for services into privatized sectors like long-term care and for-profit group homes. So here is a little bit of a clearer picture, but there are 6 large-scale systems of institutionalization: developmental services, largely nonprofit; psychiatric, a combo of nonprofit and for-profit; geriatric services, which are for-profit; carceral, largely not-for-profit; um, homelessness, which operates both not-for-profit and for-profit; and same with the immigration detention system. What each of these institutions reveal is a massive interconnected network of actors, economies, investments, and politics making up what Castellani referred to in 1987 as the political economy of developmental disability. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper and look at the different industries operating behind the closed doors of the institution. So on the screen, we have 4 different industries within the institution we were just in. So we have pharmaceutical, restraint, consulting, and labor. So within group homes, we often have this vision of a community home in a suburban neighborhood, and it's operated on a nonprofit scale. But when you open the door and go inside the institution, what we learn is that each different element and each hour of the day is dictated by varying corporate and governmental interests. So, to dig a little closer, we have pharmaceutical, which are the biomedical interventions into disability influenced by and large by the pharmaceutical industry in Canada, but this is a largely global industry. Restraints and pharmaceuticals together are what Alicia Broderick calls intervention incorporated. And these interventions include waist restraints, limb cuffs, helmets, wheelchair restraints, and are common in all forms of institution and often embedded into collective agreements. Now, we get into the consulting through there. And so, in collective agreements and in restraint policies by and large, there's a need to know how to do it. The trick is, we have a for profit consultant for that. And so, each of these systems together work towards creating this massive for profit enterprise where consultants train workers how to restrain people using um, large scale for profit corporate restraints and pharmaceutical interventions that we'll get into in a minute. Now, who is doing the labor within the institution? This is a really important part of the political economies of institutionalization because labor practices are so critical to understanding the political economies of these industries. The labor conditions of workers within group homes are horrific and a result of austere budgets by who else but successive neoliberal governments. And so group home operators frequently replace unionized workers with non unionized support workers who experience lower wages, high rates of stress, burnout, and turnover. Particularly affected by these labor practices are the disproportionately racialized and gendered support workers um, who experience debilitation within their specific job, working to a cycle of disablement. But because there is so little accounted for in labor, there is a large percentage of unpaid labor by group home residents, which is forced to fill the gaps caused by those austere care work components. And so we see together, pharmaceutical, restraint, consulting, and labor, that these industries transform nonprofit houses in the suburbs into large scale, globally connected economies that really tell us a lot about how we're treating people with disabilities. We're going to look a little bit closer because I think that it's helpful to see this through the lens of one drug. So, digging a little deeper in the pharmaceutical industry, 39% of adults labeled with intellectual disabilities are on antipsychotics. And you might say, well, there's a high rate of dual diagnosis. But the truth of the matter is that the vast majority of adults labeled with intellectual disabilities on antipsychotics don't have a psychosis label and so are actually being administered these drugs off label. 39% is a shockingly high number, but then we move inside group homes and we see that this goes up to 56% of adults with labeled with intellectual disabilities being placed on antipsychotics, what are also called chemical incarceration um, and chemical bonds. In to another type of institution, we know that within the community, 26% of older adults labeled with dementia are on antipsychotics. Within long term care, this skyrockets to 48%, and almost all of these are on off label reasons for using the drug. Now, it gets a little bit out of control when we get inside prisons, where up to 63% of incarcerated women in Canadian prisons are on antipsychotics off label. So, why is this happening? Why are we using massive amounts of chemical incarceration on very disparate populations of disabled people? Well, that's a great question and one that we're going to answer. The largest profiteer I have found thus far has been AstraZeneca. And so, AstraZeneca, we know, is a massive pharmaceutical monopoly, and it is the sole provider of Seroquel, which is the brand name version of quetiapine. Quetiapine is a very well administered drug, and we might ask why. Through the 2000s, AstraZeneca realized that, oh, maybe we could change the marketing for our medication and make it just a general um, mood stabilizing drug. And so AstraZeneca's Seroquel or quetiapine became one of the most um, prescribed psychiatric medications and began accounting for 40% of the company's pre-tax profits. But the pre-tax profit margin on Seroquel itself is more than 80%. And so we see that through various forms of institutionalization and various regimes of incarceration and forced institutionalization, nonprofits and our public healthcare system are turning to chemical incarceration and the global pharmaceutical market as a prerequisite for institutionalization and as a piece of the much larger political economy of developmental disability. We see this profiteer as part of the medical industrial complex, an enormous system with tentacles that reach beyond simply doctors, nurses, clinics, and hospitals, and runs its roots deep, interconnected to everything, including eugenics, capitalism, colonization, slavery, immigration, war, prisons, and reproductive oppression. AstraZeneca, as a profiteer for institutionalization, demonstrates both how we can generate profit from incarcerated people, but also how profits are used to quiet and res- restrain people who are labeled as difficult, people who are labeled as loud, and people who are labeled as um, defiant of institutional orders. For most people who have been in psychiatric institutions, their experience is frequently being put on quetiapine and never being able to go off of it, despite its many, many, many off label prescription or risks. And in some instances, I'll end with this little anecdote. Seroquel is prescribed and utilized in juvenile prisons more than ibuprofen. And so we see just how pervasive this is and what the risk is. And so, as we move to understanding institutionalization as a violent, extractive industry, as opposed to a benign, helpful tool that we can use sometimes for some people who are labeled as difficult, we instead see it as a tentacle, as part of this tentacle system of capitalism that dips its toes everywhere it can and is willing and able to restrain and incarcerate tens of thousands of people in Ontario, particularly those labeled with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so if we look at quetiapine through just the story of one person, we can go back to the group home. and think about a story from there. So, Bob was living at home until he turned 19, and then he wanted to move out. He tried to get access to community housing and was unable to get off the wait list. There wasn't any other community housing available for him because of, well, maybe check the housing market. And so Bob was shifted into a supportive living home. This home was for profit, and Bob didn't really get along with the people there, and increasingly was demonstrating behaviors that the the organization labeled as dangerous and violent. And so because he was in supportive independent living, he got shifted into a more carceral setting, a really small group home where he was forced onto quetiapine. From there, he maybe was able to live there for a while, but was never able to get work because he was exhausted from the Seroquel that really affected his everyday life. The Seroquel he was never able to get off of because of his body's addiction to the drug and the very risky side effects from coming off of the drug. And so AstraZeneca was able to profit a lifetime by creating this highly um, addictive, highly effective drug that works to incarcerate people inside of their institutions and works to remove people of their ability to exercise autonomy in their lives and in their homes. And so, as we end my presentation and move to Keenan's, I would encourage us to understand institutionalization not just as an individual problem or a one off or as a pretty small issue in the grand scheme of things, but rather as part of this much broader political economy and this much broader um, profiting off of disabled people through institutionalization. And that's it for me. I'm excited to hear from Keenan and answer questions. You can find my work there.
Okay. Step one, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Step two, I successfully share. You see that? Okay. Well, I think Brian introduced us as scholars and practitioners. I don't think I've ever been called a scholar, even when I was in university, but I'll accept it for today. And I had a feeling that was going to be a very powerful presentation. So I did put up I can advance it, a slide that shows a little bit of joy. Because my presentation is also going to be rather serious, but this is just to ground myself a little bit. My father's definitely a scholar. I helped him hold up the kayak there. Many years as a professor at University of Ottawa, and gave me some grounding for some of what I'll talk about today. My mom, my wife, and I just wanted to explain a little bit. It's definitely not a presentation about me at all, but for those who like a description, I'm going to go with a typical traditional middle-aged white man is speaking, and which leads to the question: how did you get involved in the sector and advocacy and being in this presentation? So a couple different reasons. First was as a young university student looking for part-time employment, as a history student, in fact. I saw a job ad. I misunderstood the job ad and went and applied and somehow got hired to work with people with developmental disabilities. And the most important result of that is I had an awakening, which was I have never met a person with these labels somehow in my entire life, even though I was around age 20. And I started to put together, oh, that means they were living somewhere else, going to school somewhere else, not going out to the same places that I do. So I think that was an important step for me. Also, working in the school system for a while, the old Ottawa Board of Education, where I ended up as a teaching assistant in a classroom called Trainable Mentally Retarded. And I was tasked several times with restraint. And I continued to live with the consequences of that. Basically, not knowing or having a way of even questioning that this was done. And a lot of it relates, this was the school system, but very similar to some of what Megan talked about, which is the approach taken chemically and physically restraining people for reasons that have actually nothing to do with them. The blame lies elsewhere. So those are some of the powerful motivators of my past. And, I've been working with LiveWorkPlay for 25 years now, and we never had group homes, so that's important to note. We did have group programs. We ended 15 years ago, and we support everyone as an individual for homes of their own, jobs and friendships and regular activity. So my awakening around the issue of institutions was also quite late in coming. It came as a result of starting the book play here in the Ottawa area, really as an advocacy and support group for parents, and then eventually becoming an agency in this developmental services system, and being involved with Community Living Ontario, which really started out, say, kind of in the 1950s as a movement from families wanting a different future for their loved ones and not in these traditional institutions. And, it remains quite an untold history in Canada. We're more familiar these days what happened to our Indigenous communities. But I would just point out that there is a related history, people being horribly abused and ending up in unmarked graves at these institutions around the province. So some of my inspiration and my heroes I discovered leading up to the closure of Ontario's big three institutions. I discovered some amazing people across Canada. They were part of something called the Freedom Tour. And they literally got an RV, and it had to do with the People First movement, and went across Canada, touring around institutions, and talking about them and their experience, in some cases, of surviving those institutions. So again, just fortunate and privileged to meet some of them and gain some insight into what they've been through and their history. And a couple of heroes of mine, I think they'll end up in any history books or get any awards. Richard Rustin, unfortunately, passed away from COVID. That was really sad that I did not get to give him a proper send-off. He was a very important person for me personally, but also in supporting our organization. Richard's story, he actually never lived in an institution. He's from the Windsor area, where historically that region has had a very strong movement, a community living movement. But he was just upset that, basically his peers across the province, many of them were living a more institutional life. So he became a champion. And David is a survivor of the MDC institution. And David is still with us, and he is a treasure, and is featured strongly in the Freedom Tour movie, which you can see on YouTube. So just a little bit about that. in 2013, bipartisan apology was issued to survivors of institutions by then Premier Wynne. And it was an important day, but I think in retrospect, we've seen that it was also kind of a moving on moment. That okay, these are closed. We've apologized, and since then, many various class action lawsuits have been settled. A lot of money to legal firms. That wasn't mentioned as part of the industry, but I think there's a lot of legal firms making a lot of money out of developmental services industry as well. But that was a little sad and bears some digging into from historians and others. Actually, what happened with those settlements? What happened to the information that was buried? Not a lot of it came out as a result of the settlements. A lot of people were silenced, and a lot of the money didn't get to their families who deserved to receive it. Which brings me to Groundhog Day. So I think a lot of people after 2009 and Smiths Falls and Huronia and Southwestern were padlocked for good. Okay, well, that's the end of our institutional history and we're moving on. And as Megan has explained, that it's not at all what happened. They're just different sizes of institutions. But I think there have been some genuine efforts from elected officials, bureaucrats, and people who work in the sector to do things differently. And I remember getting very excited in 2004. This process started called Opportunities in Action, and it was all about people living in community and moving away from institutional models. I really threw myself into that for a number of years. In the end, didn't really deliver a meaningful result. And the Groundhog Day is because now we have a new process. It's called Journey to Belonging, Choice and Inclusion. And I think it's probably not deliberate, but whether it is or not, some of these older documents are disappearing. So I've saved them. The Opportunities in Action document, can't really find it anymore, but I preserved it on the LiveWorkPlay website. And I was recently in one of those government webinars where they were talking about Journey to Belonging. And it was kind of presented as it was all ideas for the first time. And I was trying to say limited to what I can say in the webinar chat until I'm blocked, or they just decide not to answer the secret question panel because it's not an open dialogue. And I was trying to say, well, this is very familiar. There's nothing new here, and I was kind of rebuffed. So I went and did a bit of the work and put the documents side by side on a simple web page and was kind of sharing around. See, it's pretty much the same thing, but those efforts didn't really get any kind of a response other than my own self-satisfaction. So I present it to you here today and invite you to go and look for yourself. It's very interesting to see all the work and consultations that went into that process that was announced in 2006. And we seem to be repeating that, maybe even with less powerful language than there was at the time. So I'll dig into that a little bit. So I call this the 2080 reality. So LiveWorkPlay, just in some more context, we're a really small agency, even within just the Ottawa context, that we don't do group homes or group programs, but that's a tiny slice of where the money goes in the Ottawa region. But that is also provincially what occurs. It's very hard to get good data on these sorts of things, but through my own research and those of others, we can say something in the area of 80% of the resources we invest in developmental services goes to segregated types of outcomes. It's probably less than 20, but about 20% goes into things like supporting people to have homes of their own, supporting them to have authentic employment, supporting them to engage authentically in their community. So that reality has not really shifted in these 20 years or so since opportunities and action. And I raise this because with the next process, there's these consultations going on right now. What should this journey to belonging be? And I'm trying to help focus advocates. If we don't shift this 2080 reality, and that reality is still there in another 10 years or another 20 years, then what world are we doing? So some of that you could say, it's inertia or something, or it's just really hard to do change. Some of it's also just direct resistance to that. So from some of the powerful forces that Megan had described, but leaving out the pharmaceutical industry, because that's not my expertise, although we've definitely worked to free some people from that, and that is part of our work. But some of the larger agencies, they could be for-profit or nonprofit. Their response to a lot of the language around inclusion and belonging is really just to rebrand or reframe some of their investments. So not everyone would know a sheltered workshop is a pseudo employment situation that's created within an agency environment where people with disabilities do work-like activities, but they don't receive a wage, and the agency or company gets a contract, and then the people do the work for a few pennies an hour. And so sheltered workshop is definitely a dirty phrase. You don't hear that anymore, but a lot of those have been rebranded, and they've co-opted the social enterprise movement, which is a very legitimate thing. Normally, it involves paying people a regular wage. It's just organized differently than a traditional business, but we saw some developmental services agencies simply rebrand their sheltered workshop as a social enterprise. They consulted lawyers to make sure that the way that the workers are involved is legit and meeting labor code, and basically have carried on. So sheltered workshops still exist in Ontario. They have been eliminated in many parts of the world and North America, but it's still something that is done here in Ontario. And another interesting one, there's some different ways of going about this, but since group home eventually took on an institutional flavor, there's different rebrandings of those as well. One of them, there's a consortium, and they call it intentional community. So whether it's a traditional style of group home or some floors of a larger building, maybe they're getting together with the developer with some property that they have, and they're putting a program space and living areas into a building, and then aside of that, on other floors of the building, maybe it's regular rentals or condominiums or such things. So there's many different ways of going about it, but they explain the congregation of people with disabilities as an intentional community. And what goes on there, it's all part of this narrative about choice. So it's this very disingenuous activity that goes on throughout our sector, where you ask, people with disabilities or their family members are asked, well, do you want this? Do you want to be here? And they say yes, and then they put out the results. Oh, we polled everybody, we did independent research, and yes, this is a choice. They want to be here. And of course, what's missing is they're not being offered anything else. They haven't experienced anything else. They don't have any viable alternatives. So, a really nice group home is definitely more attractive than absolutely nothing being offered at all. So that choice dialogue is showing up a lot in this Journey to Belonging document that I had mentioned. It's also generating another way for further encroachment of the private sector. So we already have this sort of a gray market situation in Ontario where tax dollars, public dollars are distributed as direct funding to individuals or families who then purchase service from the marketplace. And major issue there is that the sector, despite its problems, does have some regulation and oversight. Some of it may be misdirected, such as training people in restraint when they don't even do restraint. And like at our agency, to meet our quality assurance measures requirements, we're required to go through this training. And then we immediately have another training to remind our staff we never do this. So that's a peculiarity. But within this gray market, so completely untrained, unvetted workers can be hired through this process, whereas going through an agency, that would not be possible. And these are coexisting with the same tax dollars. So that's a fascinating problem. So what's not on the menu matters, and this is something I've learned. So policy people work really hard on amazing things like United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, absolutely amazing historical process worldwide, did all the right things, involved people with intellectual disabilities authentically in the process, came out with it, got it passed, got so many countries around the world as signatories and ratifiers. And then in the end, is it making a difference? Can we use this in some way when we see things that are not appropriate in our own communities? Not really, no. Doesn't help us much. The problem is the standard of what is not meeting those protocols or what is not meeting any standards is very unclear. So, what is open, inclusive, and accessible? As you saw with my example of inclusive community, well, if you ask people, did you want to be here? Do you feel included? And they say yes. Well, then who's Keenan Wellar to say that's not just fine? And so we see this in different aspects, whether it's housing or, as my example here, with employment. So how can it be that people are carrying on in these inappropriate pseudo-employment settings? Well, again, there's no standard to apply to say what is not inclusive employment, just framed in the positive. So that's something we've worked on as an agency. It comes from work of many other people in many other fields, neuroscience, asset-based community development, social capital, intersectionality, pushing for disaggregated data about people with disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities, community-based research, disciplinary research. We've been doing some work. We're not set up to be training or going out and doing training, but we have done some with other agencies. And what we tried to do is just create a framework for ourselves to live by. How do we know when we're living to our ideal of supporting people who have an included life and community? And that's a whole other presentation where you can go to the website there and see what that's all about. But at the core of it, we put honoring personal autonomy. That's a key test for any work that any of our staff or volunteers or members measure ourselves against these principles and hold ourselves accountable. And I just want to end on some real experiences that I've had with individuals or families who have come to see me or come to see LiveWorkPlay for the first time and been through some sort of assessment in the various different systems that they come across in their life. And that was a real quote from a young man who was looking to get involved in employment. And he had been to an assessment in the employment system, and he was told he was a 3 out of 100 and therefore could not work. And it's hard to process, what's it like to be told you're a 3 out of 100, and that you cannot do something that's core to most people's existence in our communities. So a couple of stories there. This from recently. That's a gentleman named Darcy. He's being interviewed. He works at the Michaels, New Orleans, here in Ottawa. And what was interesting, there was a third party doing some filming for an employment video that they're creating. And Darcy is now a backup on cash. He primarily works on the floor, but they asked him, oh, I guess you've always been good with numbers. You really enjoy cash. And he said, well, no, this is my first time doing anything with numbers. When I was in school, they told me math was not for me. So it's wonderful that Darcy got through that and is now, of all places, through employment, found out he could work a cash register and do these tasks. And the other is related to housing. And this has a lot to do with what Megan was talking about. So Royce was on the cover of the local section of the Ottawa Citizen. I think it was around 2011. And basically, the dynamic that occurred there was either he was going to be, uh, drugged into a coma, or in a highly restricted facility, and these were kind of what the family was presented with as the only options. And we got involved, started asking the question, well, what if he just had maybe less restricted environments and he'd actually do better? And, we got some really strange looks. But long story short, it's been about 10 years. He's successfully been living in his own apartment. It wasn't easy, but it just took a different perspective. That when people are compressed and incarcerated, of course they resist and rebel. And we saw a human being that just needed some understanding, chance to live his life differently, and that is Cat Benny that he had just recently adopted. Uh, he posted that on Facebook, much to his family's surprise, as they said he would never be interested in social media. So he's basically one of our most powerful influencers. And I'm going to stop right there with some happy news about Royce.
All right, thank you both very much. One of our goals with this seminar series is to facilitate meaningful connections between people in all the different fields of accessibility and disability studies. So we're going to start the discussion portion by giving Megan and Keenan the opportunity to ask questions of each other, if they have any, having seen each other's talks, after which we'll open up to audience questions.
Who starts? I'll start. So, Megan, the way you approached the problem and presented the problem and described the problem is not the conversation when I get together with my developmental services colleagues and we talk about, man, like things are not getting better for this population that we care about, and it's going in the wrong direction. We're feeling kind of helpless and hopeless. And I don't know if you have any thoughts, like how can we get this dialogue into the forefront? It's nowhere near what people are talking about, and we're just feeling really really helpless, looking for help.
Yeah, that's a great question and has been a really important part of how I approach my research because there's been such a long project of depoliticizing disability, particularly, and removing it in so many ways from the public consciousness, and whether that be through transforming these formerly radical deinstitutionalization organizations into being largely state-funded enterprises, is a really big part of that. And I think demonstrates, why we have so many challenges in the area, because right now we really elevate, and by we, I mean the media and the government, and I think also like broader advocacy efforts really bring to the forefront and only let speak people and organizations who are part of institutionalization, who facilitate institutionalization, or if they don't facilitate institutionalization, they work alongside organizations um, that are really focused on institutionalization. And I think like within our own movements and conversations, we need to be actually talking to organizers and disability justice movements, because that's where the radical politics are, and that's where um, we have ideas and possibilities for greater conversations. And I think like a big sticking point is the role of the media in it all. The reason I made the podcast was because I felt like I had been writing for a long time and nobody was really paying attention. And so moved it to the podcast sphere. And I think it helped a bit, but we still don't see those same conversations. And I think that it's time for our movements to be working with more radical um, pieces of society, like the drug decriminalization movement and like the prison abolition movement, and the movement to end long-term care. And I think that we have some really strong advocates in those movements who maybe, and I think a big part of it, don't necessarily like work with that many people with developmental or intellectual disabilities.
Hmm.
And so I think that there is going to be like this time where we have to be like teaching each other and learning from each other to be able to have these conversations. But at the end of the day, I think it's time that we get radical and begin to dismantle the systems that are holding this all in place, like the global pharmaceutical industry and like our broader uh, engagements right now with privatized healthcare and all of those components. So yeah, I think that was a really great question, and I am excited to keep those conversations going between movements and really like forge a strong path forward that isn't just let's make a social enterprise or let's make a group home like prettier. um I have a question for you, which I was struck by first of all, thank you for your work digitizing the archives and the government website pieces, because I think it's really important that people know that every day, like a document gets removed from the government web pages and archived elsewhere, completely inaccessible. But I was struck by the language of choice that you brought up in the the housing lens, but I think we see this conversation about choice pop up in so many places about disability, and particularly right now with the conversations around MAID and specifically the expansions of MAID and people saying, oh, well, people with disabilities have a choice. And we see that again with what you were talking about with supportive funding and group homes and all of those services. So I was wondering if you would elaborate a little bit on what a choice might look like for someone who just graduated high school, is labeled with a developmental disability, and is trying to find a way out or on their own.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's actually how the whole LiveWorkPlay experiment started. We were calling it the post 21 problem at the time, in like meetings with families, because they were going, you know, to the system at the time, and then the choices they were given, they're like, I don't want any of those things for my son or daughter. What else can I have? And they're like, well, nothing. These are the choices. And so I think, that's the still kind of the heartbreaking question for that age group. I mean, first of all, there's a warehousing that's going on in the school system because people won the right to stay in school till age 21. But what is going on in that pseudo high school situation for people with intellectual disabilities? There's not really any outcomes attached or evaluation attached to what they receive. They just finish high school, and so there's a lot of warehousing going on there, which actually really is harmful, right? So people feel that they know when they're not doing something real, and it affects their self-esteem, their belief, and what their family believes is possible. And they do get some very negative messages. But that kind of goes to when I talk about the 2080 issue. Our investment in employment outcomes for this population is really tiny. And right now, it's mostly through the Ontario Disability Support Program, and that system is in a transformation process as well with a lot of privatization. It's already happened. These mega corporations that are now administering on behalf of the Ontario government employment services. So who knows? But it seems this is another layer of detachment from community. Yes, LiveWorkPlay is a very small player in some, and we're trying to deliver ODSP employment supports. It's not perfect, but it works. We've helped hundreds of people get real, authentic employment, which fixes a lot of those. It's not for everybody, but it sure fixes a lot of those issues of poverty, housing, relationships, networks. If you're authentically working somewhere, but there's such a tiny fraction of resources going to that, and we know a lot of the answers. So the research shows people have some kind of paid employment before they leave high school. The odds that they'll have some when they leave high school goes up exponentially. So something simple, summer employment, part-time employment for people with intellectual disabilities while in school would be amazing. Small investment that would deliver an incredible return. But if I can get back to your question, I think a lot of families, they're just lining up through the DSO. They're lining up for traditional day program services, and they're probably not lining up for group homes because the waiting lists are so long and it's so hopeless. It's not that they are being offered other choices, but they can line up for those. But the vacancies are so rare, so they're really struggling. They're cobbling with their passport dollars, which is usually about $5,000 people receive. It's a type of individualized funding that goes direct to the family, and they're using that to perhaps pay rent if the person is able to, their family has the resources to combine that, and perhaps hire some level of a private worker if they can't get a DSO funded placement. But I guess essentially the choices are not good, and the affordable approaches we could be taking to having an impact are not being meaningfully pursued. A little bit of a depressing answer.
Thanks.
I have endless questions, but I think we should open it up.
Okay, cool. A noble sacrifice. I will. I'll open up to we will open up to everyone, and I'll just ask people to please, as Dominique has just done, use the raise hand function if you'd like to speak, and then I'll call your names out in order. Alternatively, if you'd rather not speak or be viewed, or you don't have to have your camera on, but if you'd rather not speak yourself, feel free to post a question in the chat. And I'd be happy to read it out on your behalf and just cite your name. So with your hand up, I will pass to Dominique, please.
I have a practical question from a non-practical person. So I read a lot, and I've heard you say in all the difficult situation that if I understand well, there's a lack of public money, and there's a lack of people well-trained, and we're not greedy, or we're not just there to make money, to be at the right places to do stuff. And I was wondering, so in your wildest dreams, what could universities do to train people to make things better?
I can go. Yeah, great question. I mean, I think that universities themselves have the opportunity to create programming and courses for that include people labeled with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Those programs right now are completely underfunded, very patronizing, and I think really challenge some of the current struggles of an austere university, of like instructors having enough time to meet with students and instructors being willing to engage in various forms of knowledge making and production. But then I think, like, on the training side, I don't necessarily think well, first of all, I mean, the fact that our university systems are so embedded within the ABA approach to autism is a huge red flag. That is such a profit-making enterprise for the university, and is embarrassing that disability studies faculties would be involved with ABA at all, as we see at other Ontario universities. And so I think abandoning that is incredibly important, and ensuring that we're not participating in a form of therapy that causes so much harm in adults and children. And then I think especially in the education programs, like not or having specific programming for including people in the classroom instead of approaches that work on like segregation based approaches like special ed or like special ed training programs. And I think like we have huge investments in those as universities. And in terms of what we can do, I think the best thing that we could do would be to eliminate tuition, because that would allow for more people to be in university, be able to get training for different forms of care work programs that don't necessarily pay as much, and as a result can't, reimburse student debt as quickly, and really like incentivize care work programs. And I think that that's often beyond the scope of the university in terms of how much funding they're providing. But I do think eliminating tuition for care work programs is like a really important way that we can make some real changes. But yeah, I think those components are all really important to me, and pretty practical.
Yeah, and I left this out of my previous answer to Megan because I kind of even given up on it. But yes, so the other problem is there are no post-secondary options for people with intellectuals. That's why I jumped into talking about employment, because our college system, for example, that should be at the forefront of supporting people with intellectual disabilities to go from high school into post-secondary. And then further to that, so we have about 30 staff at LiveWorkPlay, and typically we do not hire from programs that are supposed to train people for our sector, because the training they are receiving is not appropriate to the work that we do, which kind of Megan outlined some of that. So we have I know a couple of developmental service worker instructors at Algonquin, for example, and they'll be like, yeah, I have this guy and he's like really insistent on person-centered rights and stuff. He'd be a great placement for you because he's probably not going to get work in the traditional path, when he graduates. And we actually end up, mostly hiring. For example, we have actually, as it happens, a lot of graduates from Carleton social work programs, just because they're not trained in intellectual disability or developmental services, but they tend to have kind of open to the idea that the world's not fair, and we're going to work on that for this particularly disenfranchised population, and we'll teach you, some of the ins and outs of that. But I mean, that's kind of where we're at. There's not a great direct path right now in post-secondary to prepare people for the kind of work that we're doing, and it's a self-perpetuating thing. So when people aren't being taught this, then we're also losing, where are the advocates coming from? People aren't learning about this, so they're not, people getting post-secondary education aren't coming with that education and contributing to this dialogue about how we're going to support this population to be included members of our society.
I have a question, but if I could throw in one little line there. I noticed Kira Smith is in the audience. Sorry for calling you out. Forgive me, other people, if I'm not noticing you, but we teach MADIS studies in the School of Disability Studies at TMU, and we encounter a lot of people who are in nursing, early childhood education, the psych disciplines, who talk about how this has really opened up their perspective on this or that, or it comes in different ways, and that's wonderful. But all of those, of course, took it as an elective, and there's no reason at all that they would be exposed to any of those ideas in their own programs. And just even exposure to would seem to be a great idea. Let's be clear. Not saying I'm the solution. I'm a very small part of a thing there. But Megan, you showed us how institutions funnel antipsychotic drugs into people quite a bit. But another issue with, in many ways, the history of deinstitutionalization is the history of reducing restraints to the extent we can increase drugs. We don't need systems of power don't need lobotomies anymore because there's other ways to keep people quiet, as opposed to it being solely, although without denying there were moral resistances. So my question for both of you is, Megan, through your work, but also Keenan, with your work, how often do you see implied or explicit strings attached? Is there any implication that, do you encounter people who feel that they have to be taking maybe a higher dose of drug than they specifically think they need, or deal with higher side effects than they would otherwise want? On is this vague threat, like on an individual level, is there a feeling of threat that, well, I want to stay out here in the community, I'm supposed to take this?
Yeah, I think there's a dual-sided threat of, if you are someone who has a psychiatric community treatment order, as Eric Fabrice's work has really demonstrated, then yeah, you're really forced into medicalization that you can't escape. Otherwise, you're going to go back into the treatment institution and perhaps receive more rounds of therapy or more rounds of drugs. I think that a really good example of this is the Child Parent Resource Institute down in London. It is an open institution for children. Of course, they never closed. They're two segregated schools that they operate. And so for children who get funneled into there, largely from the foster care system, they particularly outline that if they are in their foster care homes or in the community, outside of the institution, they're monitored, they are threatened with greater drugs or a return to CPRI. And then when they are brought back into CPRI, their medications are increased substantially, and then are only permitted to exit with those drugs. And so, yeah, we see this tension where if you aren't being a good patient in the community, or a good good mad person, just going to school, doing my job, never missing a day, never missing a dose, then you're able to maybe stay in the community. But as soon as that loosens up, then, or if you miss a dose or miss your CTO, or God forbid, your community-based therapist visits your place and you're not there because you had to go somewhere, a million things, maybe paratranspo didn't pick you up, and then you're threatened, or you're cut off your drugs, or you're cut off your access to community. And so we see that as a huge double-sided coin. And then of course, we know that for many people, they can't go off the medication in community because of the dangers that it poses, especially with atypical antipsychotics, which if you just stop taking them, you could die. And so what does that mean? If you have to force yourself into a psychiatric institution in order to be able to go off a drug, one, are they going to let you go off that drug? And two, if you don't go into the hospital to do that, and then you're hospitalized because of the medical side effects of stopping a drug, then you're going to be reinstitutionalized and then back into the cycle again. So of course we know that psychiatrization, medicalization, it's a constant threat that is used to reinforce institutionalization and prop it up, and then also is deeply entangled, where you can't really be in an institution without being forced to take some type of drug.
Yeah, welcome to the pressure cooker that is community-based support stuck between the medical community and the individual trying to live their life. I've been in a lot of rooms yeah, with people with medical degrees, and they have absolutely, just the fact of it, zero respect for the work that we do or any expertise that we might have, and literally fighting for people's lives who are stuck in psychiatric wards for a lot of the reasons explained, and just being medicated into what will be described as the person is now stabilized, and nothing. They have not received treatment, and I think that's an experience not just for people with intellectual disabilities, but very much more predominant, more common. Um, not having any really understanding of who the person is, what they were like before they ended up in the hospital. We've had people go into hospital, and then it became normalized that the idea that this is how the person is, and we're like, no. The day before they came in here, they were like playing the piano and performing and doing art and going to work and living in their own apartment. They're like, oh, really? Yes, these drugs that you have given are contraindicated, and now like you've turned them into this other thing. And but we're not doctors, and so it's very odd for like when Keenan is trying to explain this to the professionals. So that is an example of a situation that. But then in the community, especially with this population, we're so far from like a harm reduction approach. It's a risk aversion approach, which is where the medication and institutionalization. Those are the answers. Those protect the industry. So if we're drugging people and incarcerating them, then we're doing what's safe for everybody. Versus we're like, I think this person just needs a chance. They've had a pretty hard life. They're dealing with a lot of trauma, and it's going to take a while, and they're going to have some ups and downs. We're going to have experiences, but if we could get them through the door. But man, it is exhausting. Like taking on just one person who's stuck in that kind of situation and trying to support them against that industry to get out the other side and have a life. It's a great thing to do. It's like, of all the things I've done in my life, helping like just one of those person, I'm so glad to been a part of that. But it is exhausting and it can take over our whole organization, because it's not about supporting the person that's exhausting, it's fighting these systems. And when justice gets involved, it can go on. But it's really tough, and we're really under-resourced and quite alone sometimes to deal with it.
Passing to Natalie Amato.
Hi, thanks. First, let me say, Megan, I've listened to your podcast and recommended it to other people because it's so wonderfully done. I really hope you do another season, because I really enjoyed it, and I was also both horrified. So it was very well done. I guess my question is, so let me prefix this with I'm from Whitby, Ontario. Everybody who lives in and around Whitby knows of the Whitby Mental Health Hospital. That used to be 28 buildings. It's been consolidated into 5. And when they closed, it left a lot of people who probably shouldn't have been there in the first place, just abandoned. In fact, a lot of people ended up homeless. But those are austerity measures, right? So I guess my thing to you is, if you had the ear of policymakers, and they were specifically asking you for recommendations to implement, what would be the best advice that you could possibly give that wouldn't completely abandon people like they did with Whitby Psych, without also having them become institutionalized, whether it be with drugs or actual physical institutions? Yeah, I don't know if I explained that well, but
Yeah, do you want to take this one first, Keenan?
Try. I mean, I know from the Ottawa area experience. So when they closed Rideau Regional, which was a massive institution, and I know people that I didn't personally work on it, but I know bureaucrats and staff who worked on supporting people out of Rideau Regional into a different life. And opponents of that right up to the last minute that were trying to keep that institution open were saying, like, we're going to have people in the streets. And I think, I'm not saying there were 0 incidents of anyone that left Rita Regional who, didn't experience something negative afterwards, but it was, for the most part, I think history will show it was done really well. Those people were well supported into that transition. And so, yeah, I mean, number one, it just obviously takes resources, but I think a key component of that answer, if you look at my sort of 2080 proposition, if you really look at the number of individuals needing this type of intensive support, it's relatively small, but we're not supporting other people to have a more independent life and community because we're not providing those supports. And so some of those people end up using resources that could be better served for people that are in a more intensive need situation. So it's kind of a self-perpetuating thing where people come out of high school, they don't have a lot of quote, high needs at the time, but the impact of not going anywhere in life and living at home with mom and dad long term and not progressing, it just postpones the issue, and then they become people with complex, intensive needs. So I think part of the answer is just helping people have homes of their own and employment for who don't need all that intensive level of support, and actually in some cases could be completely free of systemic supports, at least for some time in their life. And then this would allow us to better resource the type of individual you're talking about. One of the huge issues we're facing now is this, we started out supporting people mostly in their 20s, but that was 25 years ago. So guess what? Like everyone else, we're dealing with the aging issue and realizing, okay, where are they going to live? And what we've discovered, of course, is that home support isn't working. It's too unreliable. The staffing is, these are not careers people stay in. They come and they go. It's unreliable. So we were kind of thinking, well, we can help them age in place. They just need support. Like we don't have home care services, but if we could organize that, they could stay there. And no, so we're really struggling now because we're actually at the point of looking for, are there vacancies in more of an institutional setting? Because we are past our limit of what we're resourced to do with this individual. Home care is entirely inconsistent and inadequate to their needs, and it's dangerous. And so now we're stuck in this legitimate sort of risk and worry about the individual. I don't think that answered your question very well. I apologize. But yeah, I mean, things like home care that are great ideas, but the investment is not there. And so it's contributing to the whole issue of incarcerating.
Natalie, great question. I think that it's such a very real fear that people have. I remember my sister was coming to visit, and she is not involved with disability institutions at all. But I was we were sitting outside on a bench, and a woman came up to us and was like, "There's so many homeless people. It's because of the Rideau Regional Center closing." It was this very strange thing, and my sister was like, "What? How did that just happen? No one knows what that is. You're the only person I know." Anyway, it was very funny, but it is a very real belief that people have that homelessness and abandonment of populations happens after the closure of institutions. But if we look at our environment right now, we know that we have a massive homelessness problem. We have a massive problem with people not being able to afford apartments, and a complete lack of social housing in places like Ottawa, but also in less populated cities and towns and communities. And so I think if I had the ear to policymakers at the time, I would have told them to hike social assistance rapidly. We know that when people are in institutions, they're given $20 a month. And so changing that while people were inside would have been hugely transformative, because they would have learned how to have access to money, and that they can use their money on leisure and on opportunities in the community. And so raising social assistance would be number one. And number two would be rapidly expanding social housing without the expansion of security within social housing. Because we know social housing right now basically has private for-profit cops that work within it on evictions and policing disabled people. And so removing those from community housing would be really important, and making housing available. I think access to housing is like the number one change that would have allowed for supports to be in community. And then beyond that, like, if we look at the type of supports that we fund right now or that are easy to access right now, well, if you are looking at psych care, then the only access you have is a psychiatrist, a social worker, and like maybe someone else who's been brought up in the psychiatric institutionalization system. And their focus is on medication. Their focus is on um, a type of therapy that doesn't address the trauma that they experienced in institutions. Like, I feel like people don't really recognize like the horrific conditions people who were in institutions until 10 years ago were experiencing. Like, you have been in a psych institution today, you probably have experienced some level of trauma within that experience. And so I think like access to trauma informed therapy would have been really important and remains really important for people exiting institutions. And then finally, like, I think access to cultural programming is so important. So many people were removed from their communities when they were institutionalized. If we look at Rideau, like, we know that so many people were brought in from Northern Indigenous communities and then abandoned. There was the story of one man who was flown into Rideau Regional Center, never saw his family again. He was like out of the institution for like for a decade, and then eventually found his family, and then died like 3 months later because we didn't have any of those supports and didn't have access to the continuities and like returning to your community or finding the supports that you need, or especially in those communities, providing access to supports and housing. Because we know today that removing people with disabilities from rural, remote, and Northern Indigenous communities and flying them south and then abandoning them in the city is like a huge problem. And it is like one of the major issues that we're encountering, and like one of the main drivers of ongoing institutionalization. And so I think like all of those elements together, housing, community supports, social assistance rates that are accessible, and therapy that isn't just guided by like the psychology like district, and instead is like a little bit more responsive to trauma and a little bit more responsive to individual needs, rather than applying a CBT approach to everyone and everything.
Thank you for reminding me that the original question was actually about policy. A quick circle back about housing. So I encourage anyone in the Ottawa area, look at Centertown Citizens Auto Corporation and look at Multi-Faith Housing Initiative. Those are two nonprofit housing communities that have gotten out of the really challenging sort of traditional social housing models, which congregate people in different ways and leads to all sorts of problems and private security and the rest of it. We have people who live in both of those communities, and it works wonderfully. And it really frustrates me attending, housing policy dialogues, and everyone's saying, "Oh, we don't know what the solution is." And I look at those two communities in Ottawa, and all I say, if we just did more of that, it would be amazing. Happily, Multi-Faith with a partnership has won a bid, and they're building hundreds of units in the new LeBreton Flats, and they'll do real affordable housing, not the kind that sort of meets the minimum standard. It doesn't limit developers at all in what they're trying to do. But it's going to be an amazing community. So keep an eye on that. But yes, the rates of ODSP rates, losing ground. I can't believe how much ground we've lost to inflation at the same time as housing prices have gone up, and it's a devastating combination.
Keenan, you had said you had other questions. Feel free to ask each other while we wait for a few more people to catch up.
Overwhelming. Go ahead, Megan, if you have some.
Yeah, maybe I'll wait a minute. Just give people the second, Keenan, I am curious and excited about your thoughts on social enterprises. And I'm wondering if you can spell out a little bit more how they function as pseudo-sheltered workshops. And if you have any examples that won't get you in trouble.
Yeah.
Great, but otherwise I can give the examples.
I'll
that
try.
will get you in trouble, and then it's
yeah. So first of all, this is not about the sort of social enterprise community in general, which I find is largely unaware that they are being co-opted in this way. But sometimes they are. Sometimes developmental services agencies are joining like a social enterprise or a co-op organization or something, and those organizations are very unsuspecting that this is a way of sort of rebranding something that's very negative. So they don't have that history. So I don't kind of blame them for getting fooled by that. But I think the classic is the special needs coffee shop. These stories keep showing up in mainstream media. I'm sure there'll be one tomorrow or next week or the next month. And someone's got this great idea. We'll just have this whole coffee shop, and it's all people with intellectual disabilities working in the coffee shop. And then you dig into it and you're like, okay, well, who's getting paid here? And oh, well, some of them are trainees. And there's always something weird going on where everyone's not really getting legitimately paid. And the ownership model is a bit dodgy, and one agency owns it. And, the money's going over here. And then really, does every single agency want to work in a coffee shop? There's just so much of it that doesn't make sense as an outcome, but it's very attractive to the public. I mean, they just get very wrapped up in these ideas. And, I have a good example. So there's a very well-meaning convening type nonprofit in Ottawa, and they were telling me, oh, we always use such and such because it's a social enterprise. And I said, how about this? Look for catering companies that have inclusive hiring practices and good food, and tell them, I'm going with you because you have inclusive hiring practices and good food. You don't necessarily have to look for somewhere that's framed as a special needs catering service or a special needs coffee shop sort of thing. But those are the stories that keep coming up, and I just expect to see one coming the next day. There is nothing wrong with a business with social purpose. That's a wonderful thing. It's just that make sure you understand when you see those stories, are the individuals, who do they work for? What does it say on the paycheck? How much is the paycheck? And really dig a little deeper into what's going on there. I had challenged the CBC actually on a story a few years ago where they didn't ask those questions because they just thought, hey, it's a charity that's doing this. Everything must be okay. No, ask those same questions that you would. And it's very important. So I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Thank you. I am always grateful for your thoughts on the coffee shop saving our world. I'm gonna read out a question in the chat from Jess. And Jess, I said if you could share your the petition for your housing renoviction. I know that's going on. So a question re multi-faith housing. I'm undergoing a renoviction of my home in Toronto of 10 years and tried to apply for housing at such an organization. And they deemed that my partner and I, both being assigned female at birth and genetically disabled, did not qualify as a family. I wonder if you have experience but had to advocate for disabled folks being read as partners as a family. They offered us a unit and then rescinded it after asking for ID, which might actually not be legal because my partner had a South African passport. And then it circled back to a perceived homophobia that we weren't a family and just roommates. And those units are for families and those in need. So, Jess, first of all, I'm so sorry that you are undergoing this. And I think that this is like a really important part of disability housing right now is the fact that so much of it is being offered by faith-based housing organizations and faith-based nonprofits more broadly. So when we're looking at specifically developmental disability housing, we know that some of the largest and biggest providers of group homes in Ontario are faith-based organizations, one of them being Christian Horizons, which is a Christian organization, and the other being RENA, which is a Jewish organization. Christian Horizons is, I think, a bigger red flag for me because of some of the advocacy work that they are part of, and their use of public funds on more religious grounds. But I think that, yeah, as soon as religious organizations get involved and nonprofit organizations get involved in housing, that and like especially housing for partners, we see that number one, disabled people are able to discriminate based on their faith practices, or we know that often congregate facilities only have single beds and are willing to and advocate for the separation of disabled partners. So in some instances, this happens through one partner who's disabled and one partner who is has a different disability being separated and institutionalized in different facilities based off of their disability. And so we see this, like as a type of ableism and cross disability ableism, but we also see it as part of like the bigger challenge of having not-for-profits operating state, what should be public housing initiatives like social housing or community-based housing. And so I don't have a lot of experience being read or being perceived as a family or advocating for that as a family, but I do just recognize that you're being put in a really terrible position, and that disabled people through various components, whether it be institutionalization or lack of access to housing, are discriminated against and prohibited from forming relationships, forming intimate relationships, and as being perceived as being in a romantic or intimate relationship because we're so desexualized and so removed from the realm of relation. And so, yeah, this is a huge problem within the sphere. And I hope that everyone here signs Jess's petition, which is in the chat. Yeah.
Just want to I want to stick up for MHI. Nothing at all. I know the idea. an organization like that. Believe me, they are not. The multi-faith and multi-faith housing is actually goes all the way back to 9/11 and religious leaders in Ottawa getting together and saying, we want to do something meaningful and not just thoughts and prayers to make the world a better place. And they said, let's build affordable housing and let's make it inclusive and accessible. And it includes all of their communities include units for families as well as for individuals and physically accessible units. It's a really cool place. LGBTQ plus is definitely strongly featured with everything they do. So I know it has the word faith in the title, and that can have some connotations of the type that Megan mentioned, historical within the services industry. It is a huge issue, but definitely a very different community, and I encourage people to check them out.
Right, we could, if anyone was saving one, we could fit another one or two in, especially because we get really nice full discussion answers. Oh, okay, here, I will, oops, oh Lord. Sorry, this is me in my chat, folks. That's what I'm bliff. I'm going to read out a question from Aaron for the sake of those listening at home. I'm sorry, I just have to copy it for the sake of my vision. Okay, question from Aaron. Apologies, this likely shows my ignorance, but post-secondary institutions and education was brought up earlier, and I wanted to return to that for a second. Perhaps this is a bit of an institutional inside baseball, as I'm a doctoral candidate at Carleton, but I'm curious to what extent there has been pressure placed on faculties university-wide to integrate these conversations into their various curricula, either at Carleton or at other universities. Given the tendency of certain programs and faculties, for instance, Carleton's Faculty of Public Affairs, to act as production belts oriented towards getting students into the institutions of governance, medication, business, etc. In either of your opinions, are there areas that could or should act as pressure points for the sustained and long-term shifts in socio-cultural perspectives, future policy developments, and increased policy support? Have there been some prior successes in this area which either of you are aware?
I'm very excited to answer this question as a graduate of Carleton's Faculty of Public Affairs, and a little bit invested in the inside baseball there. But I think, like, in terms of the faculties and the programs that really work on, of course, there is a prioritization of funding by the provinces towards, what they see as career or like fast-tracked into programs of employment. And so programs like the FPA or broader, like, I'm going to speak about public policy programs because that's what I have done. And I think that we see this quite a bit within the public policy sphere of really getting people on the conveyor belt into places of institutional power. And I think, like, in terms of our education, there's always like mandated courses in every program that you have to take. Some of them, there's more classes and programs, and some of them there's less, but the vast majority of those are focused on pieces that don't at all include critical perspectives or are disproportionately weighted towards areas that don't think about or consider disability, and particularly developmental disability. And so within the policy sphere, I think there's like 4 or 5 people within policy programs doing disability policy work. Michael Orsini, of course, doing big chunk of that, and then Summit in BC. But otherwise, we see like this huge gap in our conveyor belt. I don't think that there's a way to engage these conversations in those programs without, while making an impact, if we don't actually meaningfully work to include people with disabilities in the program itself. And I think like the conveyor belt function really abandons people with disabilities because of the strict requirements, the time allotment, the funding requirements, and of course, the instructors themselves. And so I don't know if there's a way that we can build it into a curriculum in the state that it is now. I think it requires us to, in disability studies terms, like crip our curriculum and make it such that we are including disabled people and disabled voices and disability policy within every specter of the course development and the program development. And so right now, like there might be in policy programs like a hint towards environmental sustainability. But if at the same time, you also have to take a micro and a macroeconomics classes, and those classes teach you that, well, externalities, you can't really think about them too hard or your brain will explode. And so it's like this real challenge. And so, yeah, even though there might be a core class exclusively devoted to sustainable development or sustainable energy, if the main aspects of the program are devoted to materially investing in our current economies or our current systems, and then all of the co-op opportunities are with NRCan, then you're going to have a challenge in actually creating people who care about sustainable energy, sustainable development. And so that's the same with disability, where if we throw it into the curriculum, but then are teaching economics that teach us economies of scale and that citizens only count or are part of the economy if they're contributing, otherwise we don't even include them in employment statistics. And so I think, yeah, we can't really just add, like, I think the thing is add gender and stir as the traditional use of it, but like gender mainstreaming like that, or disability mainstreaming, where we just like throw in disability into the like much quicker curriculum, it's not really going to make the changes that we need. And so if I was to say, think about a policy program bringing in ideas about disability or de-institutionalization or challenging like the medical industrial complex, I think we would have to have like much broader changes in the programs and changes in our university infrastructure. I think having peoples whose research focuses on elements of disability that aren't just about making disabled people employable or disabled people like part of the economy, then it's like that doesn't really bring about the excitement or the radicalness that we need. And also, like, not every disabled person is capable of working, and that's okay, but that doesn't really work with how our current education systems or policy systems or conveyor belt programs work at all. Yeah, so thanks for the question, and I'd be happy to chat about this more. I am always thinking about the lack of disability everywhere, but I'm not sure about how we can bring it in a way that's meaningful and not just contributing to greater like sectioning off.
Before we run out of time, I just want to same offer to Jess. I don't know. I haven't had time to look into what happened to you in Toronto. I didn't mean to disrespect your situation. I was just saying I know that the Multi-Faith Housing Initiative organization in Ottawa is just in Ottawa, and they're not involved in Toronto. So it seems two different situations, but I will definitely look into that. And a really neat thing happened with us was we just approached them and said, have you ever thought of including people with intellectual disabilities specifically in your communities? And they admitted it wasn't something we had thought about. And they actually made it happen. So it's just a really cool place that I find respects a lot of diversity. So that's why I'm excited and I'm defending them a little there. I apologize. And as to this current question, I think a really interesting example, I'll take it out of the educational context. We've done a lot of work with the federal government because we're in Ottawa and we're trying to support employment for people with disabilities. And an interesting thing I heard that I think connects to what Megan was saying was I got a chance to talk to someone who's really senior in the government of Canada who has not disclosed their disability, despite a 30-year career and being a very powerful person, because disability is still an HR problem. And what it takes to, if you're looking for, supports, it's still framed in the wrong way. And people don't want to go about it. And so how this relates to what Megan was saying, I think, so it's a long journey to embedding this dialogue throughout every course. It's just really what has to happen. So, I had a history student as an undergrad. If you're lucky enough that somewhere there is, within your history department, there's a course that talks about disability institutions and things. But that would really help because it wouldn't be embedded in all the other history courses, which is the same problem we've had with Indigenous communities, every marginalized population and marginalized history. If it's not distributed throughout, then just having the existence of specific courses that someone can take isn't going to solve our bigger issues. So just support that there's a lot of work to do there. And thanks, Jess, for your words. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, and on that, with much work left to do, I think we're gonna have to call it at some point. So thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, everyone, for all the questions and the great discussion. Thank you very much, Keenan. Thank you very much, Megan, for your wonderful talks and the really engaging discussion afterwards.